Hello everybody and welcome to the Drydock episode 350. This week the questions are taken from guide 421 on the T2 tankers, the Wednesday video on naval gunnery range finding aboard an Iowa class battleship, and the Friday video on the ship models of Jerry Westenberg. Our first question is from Tally Ho, who asks, did any crews try to disguise tankers to fool U-boats? Well, sort of, but there's not a huge amount that you could do. And that's primarily because, unlike these days, where pretty much any major cargo ship follows approximately the same kind of pattern, i.e. superstructure right aft, and then if it's a tanker, obviously oil tanks forward, if it's a container ship, containers forward, etc. There are a few exceptions to that layout, but that's generally what you tend to see. Back in the Second World War, there was a very distinct and obvious difference between tankers and general merchant ships, and that is that general merchant ships would tend to have their bridge and their other superstructure amidships along with a funnel. Tankers had their machinery right aft as opposed to amidships, and that meant that you'd have your funnel right aft as well, as you can see here. But for command and control purposes, the superstructure, the bridge, would be either amidships or perhaps even slightly more forward of amidships, because now it wasn't tied to the location of the machinery, and further forward is technically better for ship command. And that led to a very distinctive double superstructure profile, so there wasn't a huge amount you could do to disguise this, which in turn meant it would be fairly easy for a U-boat to pick you out if they had a clear view. Now, there was a small amount you could do, which you can kind of see here, and that is that if you are painting the ship in some kind of multicolour camouflage, disruptive or two-tone or whatever, then what you can do is try and paint the funnel and some of the aft superstructure in very pale colours designed to perhaps blend in with the sky. Now, although that won't fool a U-boat or a Japanese sub that can see a silhouette, or one that's gotten particularly close, at a distance, perhaps if they're trying to pick out which ship in a convoy they want to go after and the weather's a little bit hazy or whatever, that might be enough for them to think you're just a freighter of some description and go after somebody else. The major problem with this kind of funnel camouflage is, as you can see here, and as you'll see with a fair number of other photos, fleet oilers generally are steaming quite hard near the top end of their machinery capacity to keep up with the fleet, and that means that starting from the top and heading on down, the funnels tend to discolour with heat and soot deposits relatively quickly. So it's a measure that will only be effective for a short time at best, and so generally speaking, the best way to conceal your fleet oiler or tanker from U-boats is either just to not be where they are, i.e. well behind the lines, or if you're on the more regular merchant routing, make sure you have plenty of escorts. BK Zhong asks, why was no thought given to preserving any of the historically important auxiliary vessels when it seems many far less important or preservation-worthy vessels were? There's a few different factors, I think, going on. Firstly is, how do you define which particular auxiliary vessel is historically important? Because the one downside, at least when it comes to historical preservation of things like T2 or T3 tankers and C2, C3, etc. cargo ships, is there are just so many of them. So, which one has a particular track record that makes you go, I think we should preserve this one and not one of the several hundred others that were built? And by the time anyone's come up with that kind of idea, it's probably too late anyway. Secondly, you have the problem that, to the general public at least, auxiliary vessels are somewhat less interesting. As I've pointed out before, when you have museum ships, destroyers, cruisers, battleships, people see them and they go, ooh, big guns, I want to go see. And even though aircraft carriers aren't as immediately visually attractive to most people in the general public, They're A, somewhat recognizable as the modern symbol of sea power, and B, they have the advantage over the gunships, if you like, of having those big flight decks and hangar decks, which are much, much easier to convert into multi-purpose displays to increase the level of attraction, as opposed to the, obviously, by their very nature, very highly enclosed and subdivided gun vessels. And then I think you have two closely related issues, which are to do with the utility of these auxiliary vessels, because post-World War II, a pretty large chunk of them would be sold off into civilian service. And, well, someone who's using them in a civilian purpose, whether that be freight or oil or whatever movement, they're just going to run them basically into the ground, because as far as they're concerned, this isn't some kind of historically important vessel. This is essentially a bunch of engines and a watertight skin to move the stuff that makes the money from point A to point B. And they will modify them as much as is necessary to maximize profit. They'll maintain them just as much as is necessary to keep them going. And as and when it gets to a point that perhaps newer and bigger vessels offer a more profitable way of moving that same cargo around, they'll let the older vessels essentially run themselves into a near derelict state, and then they'll go off to the scrapyard because, well, why does anyone care? They're one of a couple of hundred others, and then suddenly there aren't any. And then you have the ones that are obviously retained in naval service. And again, because auxiliaries are very useful and necessary at pretty much all times if you want to maintain a blue ocean navy, it means that those auxiliary vessels, while they won't necessarily be as badly hammered into the ground as a commercial vessel that's being exploited purely for what it is, let's say a Cimarron class that's been jumboized and kept in US Navy service will just be run and run and run and run, and then it'll be put in reserve in case it needs to be run again. And by the time it comes around to scrapping it, to be fair, at that point, you might have actually reached a point where it's historically important enough and old enough that people might want to preserve it. But then you'll face the same issue that a number of other relatively famous warships faced, which is it's quite old and quite worn, and how much money would you need to get it back into a state where it could actually last as a museum? And then you drop back on the previous issues of who is going to come and visit it to pay for its upkeep. Now, of course, in the case of some of the Liberty and Victory ships, that has worked out, but let's be fair, the Liberty ships have a much, much higher profile than almost any other auxiliary vessel of the Second World War. Kevin Langmuir asks, how different would each navy of the major nations have looked in World War II had the Washington and London naval treaties not been agreed? I think they would have looked incredibly different, because you would have seen a trend in naval development that I personally think would actually see a peak in the late 1920s, early 1930s, and then naval development might actually drop back slightly, at least in terms of overall size, in the 1930s. So you'd end up with a rather odd-looking fleet. Now, Germany would actually be in probably a significantly worse off position than she was historically, because remember, Germany is not constrained by the London and Washington treaties, at least until she signs up to the Anglo-German Naval Agreement, which implicitly does bind her to them. But she is restricted by Versailles. And Versailles is much more important because Versailles limits how many ships she can have, the kinds of ships she can have, and how big they are. And that leads to some fairly major problems when the Kriegsmarine tries to rearm itself in the 1930s, because if you think the atrophy of large ship construction capacity in the Allied powers has been bad, it's exponentially worse in Germany. I mean, Germany was able to build a large number of capital ships in the run-up to World War I, but a good chunk of those yards are just gone by the time of the Kriegsmarine rearmament. And on top of that, the ones that are left haven't had anywhere near as much funding to upgrade their infrastructure. So when you see, Bismarcks and Scharnhorsts and the various carriers, the Graf Zeppelin and Flugzeugträger Bär being constructed, there's not any real more capacity. It's a case of we've launched this hull, one of the Scharnhorsts, we have to now put another big hull on that slipway. We don't have that many more slipways. And then you look at some of the more practical H-class, as opposed to the mid to late war flights of fancy, and you end up in a situation where you'd have to build them almost Great Eastern style, on the shore, broadside to the water, because a slipway doesn't exist that can take some of the larger ones, and there's not the time to build a new one. So Germany would be very, very constrained, even assuming that something like the Anglo-German Naval Agreement was signed, which it's less likely that it would be in this time period. Now, the reason why I say I think there'd be a big peak in the late 20s, early 30s, and then a drop-off is because Japan would be desperately trying to keep up with its 8-8 or some derivative thereof plan during the 20s, spending an increasingly ridiculous amount of its GDP on military construction. And then when the Great Depression hits, combined with the frankly unsustainable amount of defense spending they had already, it would lead to such a major collapse that effectively you'd be curtailing Japanese major ship construction for a good length of time. And of course, with a threat eased off, that eases off the build pressure on Britain and the US. But also around that time period, you most likely would have seen the ultimate expression of battleships. You're talking about probably ships with a dozen 18-inch guns or 8 or 9 20-inch guns. And I think at that stage, it would have become highly apparent that you're having to build 70, 80, 90, 100,000 ton monsters just to carry these guns and have anything like a modicum of armor capable of resisting those guns. So they're going to be hugely costly, require massive across-the-board infrastructure upgrades just to handle the ships. And at the end of the day, you're facing highly diminishing returns on the amount of fire that you can actually put out in terms of the reload times of 18-inch and 20-inch guns. At which point I think there probably would have been a dropping back, again, potentially also coupled with the Great Depression in the early 30s, to ships perhaps armed with 6 or 8 18-inch guns or 9 to a dozen 16-inch guns, but research probably going into 16, 16.5 inch, that kind of caliber, long barrel, i.e. 50, 55 caliber, higher velocity guns to try and mostly match the armor penetration capacity of those bigger guns, whilst weighing somewhat less and being able to be fitted on a smaller ship, or even if it's only slightly reduced, because then you can probably get those slightly smaller vessels, which are also therefore more economical, up to a higher speed with fairly heavy armor and these, warp speed, high velocity, smaller guns, which would offer, roughly speaking, in terms of armor penetration and protection, the same kind of capacity as your 23, 25 knot, 20-inch firing monsters, but for much less money, and capable of getting from point A to point B pretty quickly. And I think there would even have been a certain number of those slightly ill-advised, very, very, very large ships potentially being converted to aircraft carriers when it becomes clear that, well, utility-wise, there's not a lot of difference between your newer, later ships and a couple of these really big things, except for the fact that the big ones cost a lot of money to run, and it's cheaper to convert them to carriers and run them that way, which would give you big air groups, potentially the advent of twin-engine naval strike aircraft because of the sheer hangar capacity. And I think also when you're not restricted by the naval treaties, you're going to see a lot more cruiser-type submarines, X-1 Surcouf style. You're also going to see destroyers and cruisers rise in displacement, because that generally seems to be the way of things, certainly in the age of steam and steel. You have a particular class, it comes in a particular size, it grows and grows and grows and grows until it's pretty much taken over the niche above it or 2 niches above it, at which point someone introduces a smaller and lighter version, and that grows and grows and grows and grows, and so on and so forth. Quite what everyone's economies would have looked like in the aftermath of all that, I'm not entirely sure. A lot of it would have depended basically on the attitudes of the various governments. I mean, the US in the mid-1920s, for example, had a bit more of an isolationist government. And as I pointed out a few times in various other videos, for those who will probably try and chime in with, oh, but Britain was broke after World War I. No, that's a far too simplistic analysis of the situation. Britain had a much higher level of national debt after World War I than it did before. But if you actually look at the UK's debt chart, Britain spent all but a couple of years in the interwar period actually significantly reducing the national debt, something which apparently we're not even capable of doing these days. So there was the money available if they wanted to use it. They were just choosing to use it on other things. APT Waffle Mantis asks, do you think that CAD, 3D scanning and virtual or augmented reality will enable people to do virtual tours of museum ships well after those ships are gone due to deterioration or other reasons, when in-person touring is no longer an option? I think there's definitely a good argument to be made. However, there are a couple of issues that will need to be overcome first. The first one is simply data preservation, because it's all very well, creating a full interior and exterior 3D model of a warship to a point that it's of high enough fidelity to be worthy of a virtual tour. I mean, that would be impressive in and of itself. I dread to think of the file size. But then how do you preserve that? Do you preserve that on a whole array, a farm array of current generation SSDs, for instance? Well, what happens when they start to fail? Do you then have 2 or 3 backup copies spread across different servers, requiring even more hard drives? And who pays for that? Because you can guarantee some bureaucrat somewhere in the upper echelons of things will go, oh, well, I don't see why we have to have 2 copies of our 40 terabyte ship model. But just paying for that extra storage is silly. I could spend that on bonuses for myself. And delete one of them, and then the other one suffers a major file error, and oh no, now you have nothing, unless you've got some really good data recompilers. So that's one major hazard, which is kind of also coupled with, just file formats. Your 3D file format these days might be the latest and greatest thing, but in 20, 30 years, unlike a ship, which in theory would still be there, if you preserve it well enough, in 20 to 30 years, people might not have the capability of easily reading those files. And at that point, that means you're going to have the ongoing cost of constantly converting and reconverting file formats to update to whatever the latest and greatest file format is. I mean, look at how many files were saved in program languages and file formats in the 70s, 80s, and 90s that now, if you could even get them on a USB stick or something, your computer probably wouldn't have the faintest clue how to read. You need either some preserved old school computers or some specialist software to do so. And the other big problem, I think, which is related to file size, is fidelity. Because at the last Historical Naval Ships Association conference, there was a rather interesting point raised by a gentleman who is actually in the process of digitizing at least some key spaces on the museum ship that he works on. And one of the bigger problems he's come across is that he can do a 3D scan of, let's say, the bridge. Great, fantastic. It's absolutely spot on, down to less than a millimeter, perfectly accurate. And you can then obviously overlay either textures or photographs, and it will look pretty much as good as it's ever going to get with modern tech. The problem is, even the file for a small section of a relatively small bridge at that point is so data rich that the vast majority of computers, including his, can't really actually handle rendering the blasted thing. Now, you can recreate some of that stuff with 3D shapes and so forth, but then you're looking at, well, this is a theoretical representation of what is there, perhaps with some added textures or photographs meshed over the top of it, but isn't, strictly speaking, exactly what is there. And then are you just creating a facsimile of a ship, or are you actually modeling the ship, and which one is the better recreation? You know, take HMCS Hyder, for example. You could make, and obviously there are tribal class models in game in various games like World of Warships and War Thunder, but you could make a really high res, high scale 3D model for Hyder, and you could recreate it from plans. You could even recreate it from general photos to match these specific changes in layout as she's represented now. And you could even have a little toggle that you could toggle her back into World War II condition. But if you did that, unless someone was paying extreme attention to detail, I very highly doubt you'd get the little patches from the shell hits along her aft superstructure on the starboard side that are there on the real life ship. And so would something be lost? You know, I'm not necessarily saying it's completely out of the question, and some ships have been recreated in 3D already, even though they no longer are with us. I mean, I think there's a fairly substantial interior 3D recreation of Titanic, for example. So there is a lot of positive things to say about the idea, but I don't think it's yet at the stage where it could completely replace an actual physical ship that we still have. Warrant Officer Will asks, in Drydock 321 Part 2, you mentioned the theoretical possibility of building a fast battleship in the pre-dreadnought era, but putting aside all the factors you outlined as to why this was never done, purely from an engineering perspective, what would such a vessel look like if some mad monarch had overruled everybody? And how would everyone react to such a vessel being built? Well, you can kind of take some cues from looking at the Regia Elena class of the Regia Marina, the Italians, and comparing them to other 1901 period battleships that were constructed. Now, if you compare her to, say, a Duncan class pre-dreadnought, which is roughly contemporaneous, they displace about the same. The Regia Elena is 3 to 4 knots faster. They've got broadly comparable armor in terms of at least maximum thickness, but the Regia Elena is fractionally narrower, considerably longer, and of course has only a single 12-inch gun fore and a single 12-inch gun aft. Now, of course, the Duncans have a more traditional pre-dreadnought secondary battery of 6-inch. The Regia Elena has a bunch of 8-inch. That's, you know, a secondary battery concern, but the main point is you have a much longer, slightly thinner ship, hence the reduced main armament, to give you a better hull form for high speed and more space amidships for the machinery, most of them obviously coming at the cost of your armament. So if you wanted to make a true fast battleship version of a pre-dreadnought, you'd essentially have to look at the same kind of thing that was done with the Regia Elenas, but bigger. So you'd have to scale the hull to a point where you could get your 2 twin 12-inch guns, one fore, one aft, but that's going to involve a much longer vessel, and you're going to have to pack the amidships with as much machinery as humanly possible, and you're still probably only going to get maybe 23, 24 knots if you're really lucky. You're essentially combining the armored cruiser and the pre-dreadnought and into some kind of fast battleship form. So you might end up with something perhaps that looks a little bit like this. And you might think, well, doesn't that look suspiciously like, you know, sort of a dreadnought, but with less guns? And yes, but this is the thing. When you look at the length breadth dimensions of most pre-dreadnoughts and then the length breadth dimensions of the early dreadnoughts, that's why the pre-dreadnoughts tend to look a little bit dumpy if you're used to dreadnought type ships. And the thing that is probably giving you a slightly uncanny valley effect with this thing is that, yes, its length-breadth proportions are much more in line with early dreadnoughts, but its armament and overall form is in line with pre-dreadnoughts because of that massive amidships machinery space. So that's roughly one possibility of what it might look like. As far as how everybody would react to it being built, the sheer expense of such a vessel, while not actually giving you a massive amount of benefit because your speed advantage isn't going to be faster than the latest armored cruisers. Your firepower and protection aren't any greater than the existing pre-dreadnought, so you're still going to have to come into the battle line to engage, and then you have just as much of a chance of being knocked out. I think if perhaps, like you see with some of the armor cruiser programs, if Russia or France had come up with something like this as a one-off, then you might see 2 or 3 being built by Germany or Britain as responses. But I think that's probably as far as it would go, because ultimately what you've essentially created in some ways is a very early battle cruiser, but perhaps with slightly more protection relative to the firepower of the time. Because unless you intend to use this as the new baseline and you're just going to spend huge amounts of money on every ship going forward, as I said, the overall speed advantage is somewhat reduced by the fact you have to keep pace with the rest of your battle line, otherwise you risk being overwhelmed. And somebody somewhere is probably just going to take a look at this and go, well, if we are going to be stuck in the same battle line anyway, well, what happens if I take out a third of the machinery and stick an extra turret or 2 on, and hey presto, there's the dreadnought. Marcus Agrippa asks, what were the major differences between the fire control systems using radar and rangefinders, etc., between the various navies in the World War II period? Well, there's an awful lot of differences, and of course I have done some videos on rangefinding and fire control, but very briefly, you have, for optical rangefinding, 2 kinds of rangefinder, stereoscopic and coincidence. Some navies use entirely one, some navies use entirely the other, some navies use a combination of both, especially if you're the Italians. Then you have the location of the rangefinders, because a bigger rangefinder is better, but also heavier. Now, some navies, to save weight and improve stability, have smaller rangefinders mounted higher up, and then rely on further data from the big rangefinders you can find installed in their turrets in World War II. Whereas other navies, although they will have the backup rangefinders in the turrets, put either larger or more rangefinders up top in order to get all the data they need from those top-mounted rangefinders, which of course can see further, which then allows the rangefinders in the turrets to be true backups. And then with radar, obviously it depends at what point in time you are during World War II, because initially they're using air search radars in a kind of secondary surface search mode. Then you get dedicated surface search radars, then you get dedicated surface gunnery radars, and so on and so forth. And then where that radar is mounted also makes a difference. Some early radars, for example, tended to be mounted forward of the foremast, which meant you had a 90, 180, even a 270 degree view, depending on exactly where the antenna was and how much it could rotate, if at all. But you would have a blind spot of some description aft, which, for example, is what happened to South Dakota and Washington during their night action off Guadalcanal. Now, you can solve that by either putting a full 360 spinny radar higher up, but you might want that space reserved for your air search radar. You can also resolve that by having multiple radars in different locations, and that's another way around it. Different navies have different solutions for all of this. And then, of course, you have the fire control computers themselves, and those are very different for each navy. Now, the interesting thing is, of course, they're all trying to solve the same problem, but to what level of fidelity they do it, how many variables they can take into account, can they predict where the enemy is going to be if you're moving and they're moving, or are they more closely related to the World War I types where you have to reset if major maneuvers are undertaken? All of this depends greatly on not just the nation, but also what generation of fire control table you actually have installed. And don't be deceived by names either, because, for example, you might say, oh, well, Royal Navy battleships, by and large, had the Admiralty fire control table installed. Well, yes, but which mark of Admiralty fire control table? Because if you have an Admiralty fire control table Mark 10, that is massively superior to the Admiralty fire control table that's installed on a hood, even though they are both technically Admiralty fire control tables. But because that kind of information is so proprietary and closely guarded, if you compare a American Ford fire control computer versus an Admiralty fire control Mark 10 versus the units used in the Littorio class, as I said, they're all doing the same thing, but the approaches they take and the appearance and size of the solution is very different. Theodore Alexis asks, as the confined nature of the anchorage at Rosyth prevented the battle cruiser force from practicing long-range gunnery and ultimately led them to adopt problematic firing procedures, was there any other location outside of Scapa Flow which would have allowed them to avoid this problem while at the same time allowing them to be close enough to quickly intercept any German raiding forces? And if there were, why was Rosyth chosen instead? Unfortunately, Rosyth was pretty much the only one that ticked all the necessary boxes. You had, for example, a fleet anchorage at Invergordon, but that was further north, which would have made it impossible to reach the German battle cruisers in time to stop them doing future bombardments of the east coast of England. The fundamental problem with both the English and Scottish coasts is that there aren't actually that many full fleet anchorages developed up and down, except for in particular locations. Up in Scotland, to guard the north entrance of the North Sea, and because there's a lot of shipyards there anyway, hence why you have Invergordon and Rosyth. But then as you head further down, you've got some of the older, sort of the Medway, the Nore, that kind of area, right down south. But then a lot of the other port cities are not really configured to deal with significant sized fleets because there's never been a need to strategically situate fleets there. Obviously, for the vast majority of the Royal Navy's existence, Germany didn't exist. It was a bunch of city-states or, princely states. Therefore, it wasn't a threat because it didn't have a major fleet. The big threats came from France, Spain, and at various points the Netherlands. And for France and Spain, you want ports on the south coast along the Channel, and obviously there's quite a few developed fleet anchorages there. And for dealing with the Dutch, certainly in the age of sail, again, you want fleets moored on the southeast coast, hence the Medway, the Nore, and so on and so forth. So all of those areas have been fairly heavily developed, but there wasn't any real call for major fleet deployments much north of that because, well, if an enemy fleet got to that point, it meant they'd already gotten past all your other fleets at the much closer and much more easily usable port facilities, at which point there wasn't a huge amount of interest in developing them. Now, of course, there were some major commercial port areas along there. You've got places like Newcastle and Hull, Yarmouth to a certain extent as well. But these were not configured to take warships with all the necessary infrastructure and support they needed. And the other fundamental problem was that when you have all of these ports that you potentially could develop, because bear in mind, Scapa wasn't exactly the most heavily developed port facility at the beginning of World War I. The reason the fleets moved north in the first place is because of the threat of mines and submarines. And if you move further south, you end up with, well, mines and submarines potentially infiltrating or getting right up close and personal. And that was one of the bigger problems with Rosyth. It wasn't that you couldn't conduct long-range gunnery at all. You could. It just meant you had to sail out through the Firth of Forth and into the earliest reaches of the North Sea. And that was where you could run into U-boats and both U-boat-laid mines and ship-laid mines, and that restricted the amount of practice you could do. Whereas deeper in the anchorage, you were safe, close to actual Rosyth itself, but the distances involved meant you couldn't do gunnery particularly well, certainly not long-range gunnery. Whereas up in Scapa, not only could you conduct a certain degree of gunnery practice within Scapa itself, but you were also much further north, which reduced the chance of any submarine, etc., being present. Tyree asks, why don't you wear, if not a ballistic helmet, at least a plastic whitewater rafting helmet when crawling through these various military dungeons, aka the internal parts of ships, Drac? As a caver, I wince at the sight of you trying to maneuver through those steel caves. Well, the simple answer is, in some cases, I do. So, for example, when we're going around aboard USS Texas, definitely helmet-wearing territory there. But more generally, Now, obviously, do not necessarily take this as health and safety advice, because technically speaking, as a trained engineer, and more specifically someone with an IOSH certification for site supervision as well, which, for those of you outside of the UK, is the Institute of Safety, Health and something or other. Basically, it's like the certificate you have to get to be a designated health and safety person on site. Technically speaking, I should know better. Technically speaking, yes, I should wear a head covering and head protection at all times when I'm in an enclosed environment. But also, practically speaking, I don't. Mostly because I have a lot of experience working in enclosed spaces, both in my engineering career and obviously now in my historian career. And I've got a relatively decent sense for my dimensions versus the dimensions of where I'm going. Now, to be fair, it's not entirely foolproof. I have given myself more than a couple of knocks on the timbers of HMS Victory and so forth. But my general approach when you're getting to an area where things are a little bit, cramped and so forth, is just to slow down and pay a bit more attention. And that generally has kept me in pretty good stead without the need for helmet protection. But I'm sure eventually at some point I am going to knock myself silly on some stanchion or something. But, what's life without a little bit of a risk? Cuff asks, how was the shape of a warship superstructure designed or planned? Apart from trying to fit anything in that needs to be fitted, was there ever any consideration regards to aerodynamics? Initially, there wasn't a huge amount of planning because early superstructures were fairly minimal, and thus it was just a case of, well, we need a practical spotting and navigating platform. It's not going to have a huge effect, so we'll just stick it on there. But as these superstructures got larger and larger, they had to start thinking about aerodynamics and placement on the ship very, very quickly. Not just necessarily because of speed forward, although aerodynamic shaping of your superstructure could give you half a knot, maybe a bit more in terms of speed versus just a flat-faced superstructure, but also because you have sail area. Now, of course, you're not necessarily using your superstructure as a sail, but the wind doesn't really care about your intentions when it comes to the superstructure. And it was very quickly realized that if you had a substantial amount of superstructure, then if you were trying to maneuver, particularly at low speeds in confined environments like ports, if you had an unaerodynamic superstructure, a strong wind coming from the wrong direction could actually start moving your ship in directions you didn't want it to, which could have very, very negative consequences. And this was actually one of the concerns with the Nelson class, and there's a few indications that perhaps it did cause a few issues early on, which was that, one, she had a fairly substantial Queen Anne's Mansion style superstructure, and two, it was placed fairly far back on the ship, which meant that not only were the commanding officers in a position relative to the overall ship's hull that they weren't perhaps that used to, but also if she was, for example, maneuvering at slow speed to try and get into port, then if she had a crosswind, whereas most superstructures tend to be, if not necessarily dead amidships, at least mostly amidships, with the Nelsons it was feared, and again, as I said, potentially in a few cases actually found, that the wind blowing on this big superstructure could induce a rotational force, not just a sideways force, but an actual rotational force pushing the ship off of course, which you'd have to anticipate and correct for with rudder movements and tugs and so on and so forth. So there was actually a fair amount of regard for the aerodynamics of the bridge superstructure, but obviously there are practical considerations about things like, we need to fit rangefinders, we need to fit anti-aircraft platforms, spotting platforms, potentially accommodation, the bridge, possibly the Admiral's bridge, and all these other things inside. So it wasn't the overriding consideration, because if they needed to, then they would say, well, this is going to be slightly unaerodynamic, but we need this feature in there anyway, so it's going in there. And obviously everybody had slightly different approaches to how to do this. The British went for the slightly shorter, squatter Queen Anne Mansion style, big monolithic towers. The US went for this kind of sort of semi-pyramidal structure in its fast battleships. And of course, as you've been seeing, the Japanese went, at least initially, for this apparently slightly random tower pagoda style structure. However, as you can hopefully appreciate from having watched this picture for a little bit, it's not entirely without its benefits when it comes to aerodynamics. Look at it sideways on and it looks completely mad. Look at it somewhat head on like this, and you can actually see there is a degree of aerodynamic shaping going into it to help assist the ship's passage through the water. Because a completely unaerodynamic large superstructure sailing into a headwind, as I said, could cost you a few knots of speed.
Classe Cornate asks, World of Warships states that the US wanted a design with 4 triple 16-inch guns and 23 knots of speed to be the standards, i.e. in their game, the Kansas. If this had happened and they'd got this instead of the Pennsylvanias, with the Nevadas having a similar gun layout but in 16-inch and also 23 knots, where would US design lineage go from there? How would the world react? And could the Washington Naval Treaty even have happened? Before anyone gets up in arms, yes, I know this drawing is of a ship for 1918, but I'm using it for illustrative purposes because it has the same armament and speed as that asked in the question. Now, the Kansas design, as seen in World of Warships, is, well, firstly, it's a modernized design, but it reflects an interpretation of what you would probably call a preliminary Tillman. So the famous Tillman design series is from 1916, but the first questions raised by Tillman were 3 years earlier in 1913, and the question was essentially the same: how big is all these things going to actually get? And one of the early designs that was sort of vaguely sketched up and thrown his way was a ship with 16-inch guns capable of 23 knots. A couple of other designs were drawn up, but it would be a while before he went, whole hog, and you got the what you might call proper Tillmans. But there are a few problems with getting a ship like Kansas in some earlier form placed in the time period you describe. Firstly, it's essentially impossible to have the Nevadas armed with 16-inch guns for the very good reason that the Nevadas are well under construction before construction has even seriously begun on the 16-inch gun. In fact, the Nevadas begin construction before the proper design work has even started on the 16-inch gun. And then you have the fact that the Nevadas are also reflecting a switch over to, at least partially, to oil. They're also going over to turbines. They're also doing the all or nothing. And they're also testing out the triple turret. And historically, there was even a fair amount of hesitation about ordering Pennsylvania and Arizona the way they would eventually be armed, because at the time it came to order them, they hadn't actually proved the triple turret would work yet. So trying to add a kind of, well, we want to put 10 guns on in an experimental triple turret as well as a regular twin, but everything's going to be expanded up because we're going to fit a gun that we haven't actually designed yet, let alone tested. Yeah, the Nevadas are never getting 16-inch guns. And for that matter, the Pennsylvanias were never really looked at with 16-inch guns. The 16-inch gun, via serious design work beginning to wrap up and then construction and testing, does overlap with the laying down of Pennsylvania and Arizona. So it's a little bit more plausible to say, well, maybe they could have looked at having the Pennsylvanias with 16s. However, in reality, all of the Pennsylvania preliminaries are looking at 14-inch armament, except for a couple towards the very end, where they're actually looking at 15-inch armament, very similar to the Queen Elizabeth's, 4 twins for 8 guns. There are no extant designs that I'm aware of for the Pennsylvanias or for a Pennsylvania alternative armed with 16-inch guns, let alone 12 16-inch guns and triples. Immediately following the Pennsylvanias and in line with the early Tillman, there are some designs for a 16-inch ship with 10 guns, so basically reverting back to a New York and Texas style 5 twin gun layout. And that kind of idea does keep getting batted back and forth during the standard classes development period. Not necessarily always with 10 guns, quite a lot of them are 8 guns and look a little bit like early Colorados, but they're always got the 16-inch guns in twin turrets. It's only when you're looking at the Tillmans and the preliminary Tillman that you see any idea of a 16-inch armed ship with triple turrets in the US Navy. And of course, those designs aren't taken particularly seriously. But assuming for whatever reason that they decided to pause construction on the Pennsylvanias, they went with this sort of Tillman dream, despite everybody being horrified by it, well, you're going to have a few interesting consequences, because the sheer size and cost of a 23-knot, 12-gun, 16-inch ship in, the 1914-ish period, given the US Navy budgets at the time, is going to be so great that, given it took a bit of a fight just to get the funding for the Arizona, you're not getting 2 ships, even. You'll get 1. So Pennsylvania, somewhat delayed, will be a one-off. And honestly, most likely at that point, the US Navy is going to go, yeah, great, we've got this really powerful single ship. This is basically useless to us, because at that stage, Congress is only going to give you funding for one of these ships a year, and maybe even one every 2 years. And you're not going to be able to go back to them and go, we want something bigger. So I suspect they actually would have reverted to a smaller design, perhaps either the 10-gun 5-twin layout, or drop a turret to reduce the size of the ship and get a 9-gun 3-triple layout. So I can foresee the mid-1910s being a really confusing time, where subsequent ships are being reduced in capacity simply so that they can have more than one of them every so often. Now, obviously, when you get towards the end of the 1910s and everything picks up again in terms of money and budget, then you will see things like the Colorados, or a 9-gun version thereof, instead of the Tennessees, and then the Colorados themselves perhaps resembling an early South Dakota. But I think world reaction would generally be somewhat muted, partly because of the very small number of these ships that would be being built, but also because of the First World War and a relative moratorium on capital ship construction in Europe at the time. The Japanese will probably respond in their own way, probably, advancing some, probably actually skipping the Nagato, so maybe enlarging the Issei design and dropping a turret but increasing gun caliber, so essentially getting a Tosa or smaller Tosa style earlier on, that taking the place of Nagato and Mutsu. But the British and Germans might, either in the British case resume, or in the German case accelerate capital ship construction in the mid part of the war, sort of 1916-ish, which will probably coincide with Jutland as well, because they'll be looking at it going, okay, we've got some lessons from Jutland, and by 1916, you might have 2 or 3 of these US monster ships in service, at which point both navies, particularly the British, might go, you know what, we've had a little bit of a break, now it's time for us to respond. And yeah, there probably will be a Washington naval treaty afterwards. It's probably actually not going to be as good for the Americans, because the Japanese, relatively uninvolved in World War I, but willing to spend a huge amount of money, will probably have at least a couple of Tosa alikes in service. The British, probably having restarted battleship construction in 1916, are probably going to have, at least 2 homogeneous classes and possibly a related set of battle cruisers ready to go. And the US Navy is going to have probably 3, maybe 4 really odd hodgepodge designs of different armaments, different turret numbers, different numbers of guns in the turrets, and different speeds from that period in the middle of the 1910s, and then maybe a class or 2 either built or under construction, probably a class built, another class under construction. And then when the Washington Naval Treaty comes about, well, whatever people are building at the end of the 1910s is going to become the new standard. So it won't be 35,000 tons, it'll be a little bit more than that, but it'll be whatever that new displacement is, plus 16-inch guns. But the disadvantage the US is going to have now is it's going to have a mixed speed battle line, and because of having fewer ships built in the, if you like, quote-unquote standard period, yes, you're going to have more 16-inch armed ships, but the British are probably going to have as many, and in more homogeneous uniform classes. And because you don't have as many ships, period, it means that in this revised Washington Naval Treaty, the US is going to be forced to retain more of its old 12-inch ships, whereas the Royal Navy is going to be, at that point, just a mix of 15 and 16-inch ships. So overall, it's probably actually a negative outcome for the US. Lord Drucken asks, it's been mentioned both in your videos and elsewhere that the various European powers regarded the American Civil War as a sort of testing ground for new military technologies, which included ironclad warships. Outside of the more obvious, such as the implementation of the gun turret and the reintroduction of the ram, what other naval developments made during that war did Europe consider to be of some value? Well, there were quite a few. One of the biggest was the entire monitor concept. Suddenly everybody who had rivers or harbours to protect was very, very much up on the idea of the monitor as conceived of in the US, i.e. a shallow draft, floating armoured raft with some heavy gun turrets stuck on top of it. Here you can see a model of the Leitha, one of the first responses to the advent of the type, which was obviously on the Danube in Central Europe, but the Austro-Hungarians, well, Austrians, then Austro-Hungarians, built a huge number of those. A bunch of other sort of central-ish European powers built a number of them themselves. The more coastal and oceanic powers even got in on the act, building either diminutive coastal defence vessels or harbour defence vessels like the Cerberus, which were kind of the logical evolution of the type. The US Civil War also, to a certain extent, pointed the way towards larger guns. Admittedly, some of that was due to the US being a little bit behind Europe in terms of high-speed gun technology that didn't explode in your face, but it had shown that it was possible to mount some very big, very high-caliber guns on various ships. And that was, if not necessarily immediately adopted, it was certainly taken away and thought of by the European powers. And then as you got, maybe 5 years further down the line, when people were thinking, well, we might need to put 80, 100-ton plus guns on ships, they had this body of knowledge back from the US Civil War that said, yeah, then you can actually do that. Also, how to conduct a coastal blockade. Obviously, there's a whole bunch of lessons you learned from the American Civil War. The US tendency on a lot of their sort of corvettes and sloops, rather than having a small battery of regular cannon and maybe some shell guns, to also include a couple of monstrous, essentially anti-capital ship weapons, also bled over into European ship design. That, to a certain extent, had been the case on both sides of the Atlantic before the war, but with things like Kearsarge and so forth, there was additional value seen in that, so you see an uptick of that in European ships afterwards. But there were also quite a lot of lessons in terms of what not to do that were seen as quite valuable in Europe. So the kind of sloped casemate ironclad like CSS Virginia was seen as, generally speaking, not a particularly good solution. The Confederates had built quite a few, none of them had done spectacularly. But you also had things like the relative success of Confederate raiders, and that led to a series of, not directly, but influenced a series of negotiations to try and dispose of that concept, at least in part. Glenn Ricafrente asks, why didn't the Japanese allocate more naval forces to their Dutch East Indies campaign? Given the strategic importance of the operation, one would think they would have come in with a sledgehammer rather than forces that didn't look to be that much stronger than the ABDA fleet, at least on paper. Were they so sure in their material superiority? It's a combination of factors. Partly, ABDA is around for a very, very short period of time right after the Japanese juggernaut starts to get going. So, to a certain extent, the Japanese are unboxing pre-planned operations with, roughly speaking, pre-planned escort fleets. So, there isn't really the scope to suddenly start changing up exactly what you're going to commit and where when you're on a rather tight time schedule. Plus, they are committing some fairly substantial forces in terms of some of their carriers and so forth to, if you like, periphery operations, if you consider the ABDA area the main thrust. So you've got things like the attack on Rabaul, which is supported by multiple carriers, the attack on Wake Island, which is supported by other carriers. Essentially, in terms of their carrier fleet, the Japanese are committing that in the first couple of months of 1942, mostly to objectives that are somewhat closer to US interests, the extreme southeastern part of their advance and the eastern part of their advance, where they're therefore more likely to come into conflict with the US carrier forces, which they know are still around, and any surviving US capital ships as well. So that's their main focus for the big heavy hitters. They have the battleships more centrally located, ready to respond if it looks like either the US Pacific Fleet, what's left of it, or the British fleet in the Indian Ocean might come after them. But obviously after the destruction of Fort Said, they're more thinking about going after the British rather than the British coming to them. And part of the reason they pulled the trigger on all of this is limited fuel stocks that are running out. So if the US seems to be on the back foot and you've got your heavy forces committed to screening there, the British have just had a severe reverse and are trying to rebuild their forces in the Indian Ocean. Therefore, what's left, they didn't necessarily expect something like Abda to arise. It would, to their mind, still be a kind of a scattering of various conflicting interests. But also, even when you look at the on-paper statistics, ultimately there are a very small handful of, if you like, full-sized warships there. Yes, if you list off this many cruisers, this many destroyers, versus that many cruisers and that many destroyers, it might sound relatively equal. But the Japanese have, they're fairly confident that the ultimately slightly undersized Dutch cruisers and the mostly older and or undersized British and American ships, I think Houston's pretty much the only real full-size cruiser that's there, and a bunch of old destroyers, are not going to substantially threaten a roughly equal numbers force of much larger, much more powerful Japanese warships. And as it turned out, they were pretty much right. Robert Henry Ilston asks, what was the likelihood of your average, i.e. not an officer seeking career and advancement, golden age of sail crewman of the various sea powers actually seeing action during their career? It obviously depends quite a lot on circumstances, because if you're in the Royal Navy, for example, your chances of seeing action are probably considerably higher, because if there is a war at sea going on of any substantial size, the Royal Navy's probably going to be involved somewhere along the line, and quite actively. Whereas if you're in the French or Spanish navies, not only are they involved, or the Dutch Navy for that matter, not only are they involved in conflict less often, statistically speaking, but they also don't tend to see as much action because they spend a lot of time being blockaded in port, or refusing action and so forth. Obviously not all the time, but in net terms it is going to reduce the possibility of a French or Spanish sailor seeing action. Plus, of course, you have different ways of enlistment. So a typical Spanish sailor, he has his term to serve, he serves his term, he goes back ashore, as opposed to a French or British sailor who might be in service for quite a lot longer, at least if they have much of a choice in the matter. And obviously there are more extended times of peace, but if you're looking at the latter part of the 1700s or 1750 onwards, there's not necessarily always a war going on, but there's more years when there is a war going on than there aren't. And then if you're, say, aboard a frigate, you're much more likely to see action than if you're stationed aboard a ship of the line or an unrated vessel. The flip side to that, of course, is that if you do see action aboard a ship of the line, it's going to be probably one of the big actions. I mean, yeah, sure, third rates do fight small actions and occasionally take down frigates and so forth. But statistically speaking, if you're the crewman of a ship of the line, the most likely action you're going to see is a big fleet battle. As opposed to a frigate, you might see lots of small actions, 1v1s, anti-merchant ship and privateer actions, that kind of stuff. So if you want sort of really high end versus really low end, if you are a British sailor aboard a fifth-rate frigate in the 1750 to 1815 period, then you are extremely likely to see action. I'd say probably 70 to 80% odds that you'll see some kind of significant engagement. Whereas if you're a Spanish sailor called to service in the late 1760s through to the very early 1770s, there's almost a zero chance that you'll see any significant conflict. Jeffrey Conley asks, I really enjoyed your collaboration with Epic History on the major battles that Nelson was part of. My question is, if they did ask you, would you be willing to do another one on naval battles in World War I? I'm certainly not against the idea. If they would like me to work as their historical consultant on a Naval Battles of World War One series, I'd be perfectly happy to do that. Um, just selecting which ones to do would be the interesting thing, because of course you've got relatively small actions like Coronel and the Falkland Islands. That would make a nice pair. Then you've got Dogger Bank, which is a little bit bigger, but still not massive. You've got first and second Heligoland Bight and a lot of other smaller actions. You've got the stuff in the Baltic and the Black Sea, again, relatively speaking, small actions. And then, of course, you've got the big shadow of Jutland hanging over everything. So, what do? If you wanted to do it in trilogies, you could do perhaps first Heligoland Bight, kind of first big clash between the British and the Germans, then Dogger Bank, then Jutland. That would make a good escalating trilogy. Or you could do something like Coronel, then the Falklands. So this is your kind of anti-radar operations, and then maybe also do Sydney versus Emden, or have the third one be a series of anti-radar operations. So Sydney, Emden, the taking out of Karlsruhe, etc. Königsberg, and all of those as a loose series of small battles all wrapped up in one. That could be your anti-radar trilogy. Greg M. asks, thinking about the series on US fleet problems from the 1930s, what was the most important lesson learned that worked out well in World War II? And conversely, was there a lesson that could or should have been learned that wasn't? Well, the most obvious, elephant in the room from the fleet problems was it is entirely possible to attack Pearl Harbor using a large amount of carrier-based aircraft and catch everybody by surprise and sink a bunch of ships at anchor. That is like the example of any lesson you could possibly take away from the fleet problems that wasn't really applied. In terms of the most important lesson that worked out well, I would say there's two possible contenders to my mind, one of which is a lesson that was simultaneously actually good and bad. So that would be how to disperse carriers, because in theory, when you look at the lessons of the fleet problems, the US Navy is essentially being told, look, there's a decent chance that your ships might get intercepted by cruisers. So that's a bad thing because it influences the design of the Yorktowns. It also influences the design of the Essexes to have belt armor and low mounted deck armor against cruiser grade gunfire, which it turns out they don't need, and rules out open hangar but armored deck designs that perhaps would have been the perfect carrier for the Pacific War. But at the same time, the vulnerability of the carrier is emphasized to a stage that they decide to isolate their carriers into individual task forces, and then operate them as a series of ones or later twos instead of grouping them all together like the Japanese do in the Kilo Butai. Now, you can argue whether that's a strength or a weakness in overall terms, because obviously if you're operating a single carrier on its own, essentially, then you have to launch the entire flight deck group, or your entire air group, or at least a good chunk of it, which does lead to these extremely extended strike package dispatch times in the early part of the war for the US Navy. But on the other hand, it means that the main intention of that splitting up, which is that if one carrier is found and attacked and sunk, you don't lose the rest, that actually plays out fairly well for the US Navy in the first part of World War II. Because when the Japanese attackers that find the Lexington hit her and obviously inflict fatal damage, although other aircraft will find and hit Yorktown, they don't see the two together, so they don't get Lexington and Yorktown at the same time and potentially fatally damage both of them. And likewise at Midway, poor old Yorktown gets hit again, but Enterprise and Hornet, which are off doing their own thing elsewhere, don't get found and don't get hit, therefore preserving them. Now, obviously, that's not great for Yorktown, but overall, it's better for US Navy overall carrier numbers going forward before, the anti-aircraft armament and fighter control and direction can be properly spruced up. And you see the same thing at Eastern Solomons and Santa Cruz Islands. In every one of the major 1942 engagements, despite the big downsides of the slow dispatch of strike aircraft and such, the fact that the carriers are isolated from each other does mean that at least some US carriers will survive each engagement, which is pretty vital at a point where, well, let's face it, US carrier survivability in 42 isn't that brilliant. The other big lesson, which I think works out really well in World War II, is the importance of at-sea resupply, at-sea refueling. Now, of course, there are a lot of lessons to be learned, a lot of ships to be built in the Second World War, but the US Navy does go into the war with a relatively decent appreciation of how to do it and the techniques to do it. They adapt, they expand, they get better during the war, but it's actually, putting them on a good footing to start off with, as opposed to some other navies which don't have as much experience, if any. Alex Moskovitz asks, which navy had the most efficient fleet in being and when? That is, they spent the least amount of resources to tie up the largest amount of their adversaries' resources. Well, this is all going to depend on how you define least amount of resources, because there's least amount on an absolute scale, but that might not necessarily hold true for the navy in question. So what on the global scale might count as a very small investment, for that nation might count as a very large investment. But if we're going purely by financial terms, i.e. on a global scale, who spent the least to tie up or deter the most, I would say, for me personally, the winner is the interwar Swedish Navy, simply because they're one of the very, very, very few times where a fleet in being, and a relatively small one at that, actually flat out worked in deterring an opponent from coming after them at all. The documents I've referred to multiple times in various Drydocks, when the Kriegsmarine drew up their plans after the Norwegian campaign, when they were asking, well, can we take out Sweden as well? And the Kriegsmarine essentially said, yeah, we technically could, but it would cost us so much. The Kriegsmarine would essentially cease to exist as a worthwhile fighting force, at which point the Royal Navy will come in and just absolutely stomp the ever-living daylights out of whatever is left, and we're out of the sea war, which is obviously bad. So, yeah, the Swedish Navy actually just flat out managed to deter having an enemy in the first place, which is the ultimate victory when it comes to being a fleet in being. But of course, in terms of a fleet in being tying up enemy resources, as in there is a conflict going on, well, putting the shoe on the other foot, you have the Germans basing Tirpitz for quite a while out in Norway. That ties up a very large number of Allied resources, although, again, you could argue that part of that is due to the fact that at various points you have Scharnhorst, Admiral Scheer, Lutzow, Admiral Hipper, Prince Eugen, and a variety of smaller craft all there as well, which, complicates matters somewhat. But Tirpitz is the big thing that means you have to commit multiple battleships and aircraft carriers and large cruiser and destroyer formations and so forth. The only sort of slight thing against it is that it's not a willing role that the Germans are taking up there. They don't want Tirpitz to sit around at anchor in Norway absorbing Allied resources in escort duty, because that actually makes the job of the U-boats and the Luftwaffe a lot harder. They want to be able to deploy Tirpitz. They want to be able to sink ships. They don't have the fuel to do so, or a lot of the time the escort forces. But ultimately the effect is that of a fleet in being, even if they don't necessarily want it to be. And I suppose if you want to look at it through a slightly crooked lens, you could potentially make an argument for the Confederate Navy. And now the reason I say you have to look at it through a slightly twisted lens is because, again, much like the Germans, the Confederates don't want to have a small fleet in being. They want to have a navy that is either large enough or, failing that, powerful enough in individual ships to challenge and break the Union blockade. But they don't have the money or the resources to do so. What they end up having is just enough money and just enough resources to have just enough raiders and just enough ironclads and so forth to force the Union into having an absolutely gargantuan fleet in terms of hull numbers, building numerous monitors, commissioning a bunch of ex-merchant ships, as well as utilizing pretty much the entire full strength of the pre-war Navy, plus building new wooden warships as well. And you look at, admittedly, the Union fleet at the end of the American Civil War is huge, but it's huge because they've had to essentially try and cover all bases in the face of a, relatively speaking, small investment by the Confederacy. Of course, it is also a civil war, which is another issue there. But, in terms of costs spent by the Union to crush costs spent by the Confederacy, it's a pretty lopsided affair. And that brings us to the end of this week's Drydock. Thank you very much, everybody, for listening, and I hope to see you again in another video soon. Thanks for now.